wallboard, drywall from Mexico. Our partners in the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement that President Trump himself negotiated, that he's blown up. This will make housing costs much higher. It'll make insurance costs much higher as insurance companies figure out what it's going to cost to replace that damaged automobile or that damaged home. What's the response to Mr. Trump, who claimed he wanted to lower prices, to the fact that cars will cost more money? He says, no, I couldn't care less on the increase in car prices. We're going to get $6 billion less for California from tourism because people are angry at us. They don't want to travel to the United States. Stocks and bonds are cratering, and it's time for Republicans to stand up. It's great for billionaires like Treasury Secretary Bessent to say there's going to be a detox period, or for Commerce Secretary Lutnick to say the recession would be worth it. It's not worth it to people who depend on their savings. They're looking forward to retirement, hoping to pay their bills. This is really wrong, and we need to say it. I would just say to the media, there's a lot of criticism of folks for not reporting on the infirmity of President Biden. There's a lot of groupthink around that. When you hear people say there must be some strategy for this, call that out, find out what it is, and be aggressive about this. This needs to stop, and we need your help. The other thing I just want to mention is that what we're talking about this week with debt and deficit, of course, they all claim to be deficit hawks. We're now in a situation where every year we're borrowing $2 trillion just to pay our expenses. And now Republicans want to extend $4.5 trillion in temporary tax cuts skewed toward the wealthy, saying there's no cost. So because Lindsey Graham has declared there's no cost to this, it magically disappears. It's like sending your kid to college, paying for her expenses for 4 years, and then she tells you, I'm just going to have you continue the current policy baseline of paying for me as if there's no cost. Of course there's a cost to it. Don't be fooled. You got to call this out. And soon we'll see it in the bond markets, in the 10-year bond markets. They're not planning on paying down the debt. They're going to blow it up. Along with tariffs, this will make it more expensive. Already we see the biggest expense in our federal budget is interest. We're just going to see more of that. We're going to be paying today for the things we did yesterday. It's going to make everything harder to do. This is a disaster. It is a disaster, and it needs to be called out, and that's what we're here today. I appreciate Joe Neguse having us out to talk about this, but this really needs to be called what it is. This is a real failure on the part of the Trump administration. Now I'd like to turn over to my colleague from Texas, Lizzie Fletcher. And Lizzie?
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Scott. And thank you so much to Assistant Democratic Leader Joe Neguse, who is a real superstar from the class of 2018. So your 2018 colleagues are so proud to get to work with you, and for your leadership and for bringing us here to talk about this hugely important issue, because there's so much going on right now, and there's so much chaos, and at a time where these reckless tariffs and rising costs are making life more expensive and more difficult for Americans, congressional Republicans are doubling down this week on this absolutely reckless budget resolution that betrays the American people. And as we have already heard today, Republicans plan to have the House vote on the Senate budget that proposes devastating cuts in spending for programs that Americans rely on, and at the same time increases deficit spending, makes this ridiculous assumption of kind of baseline spending, and gives a big tax cut, increases the debt ceiling without consequences in their mind, but there will be consequences for the American people. We are already feeling those consequences in my home state of Texas. We hear about it all the time in every facet. One thing that I just want to touch on and highlight about the budget resolution, true in the original House budget resolution as well as this one, are the devastating cuts that it calls for funding for services that people rely on, including Medicaid, and that is coming to our committee. Medicaid is a lifeline that 1 in 4 Americans relies on for their health care, and that matters to them, but it matters to all Americans, and we need to be clear about that. There are more than 70 million people in every state in the country that rely on Medicare to receive health care. In my home state of Texas, Medicaid provides health care to 4.8 million people. And Texas has very narrowly defined eligibility for Medicaid. If you are an adult under 65 that is not disabled or raising a child, you are ineligible for Medicaid, no matter how low your income is. So many people in Texas don't even qualify for Medicaid. But the people who do are children, adults with disabilities, people living in nursing homes, and moms who've just given birth to their newborn babies. And I should also add, as we have this conversation about Medicaid, that 57% of the adults in Texas who rely on Medicaid are working. So despite these narrow limits in my district, the 7th Congressional District in Houston, 110,000 of my constituents rely on Medicaid, and it matters. It matters to the people who are relying on Medicaid for their health care, but the harm doesn't stop there. It matters to everyone who is relying on these systems. Just a few weeks ago in one of our hearings, I asked a witness in our hearing, what does it mean that Medicaid covers 50% of the births in Texas? What will cutting Medicaid mean? And they said, well, it will have devastating consequences for the people who rely on Medicaid to pay for those births, but it will also mean that hospitals across the state can't afford to keep their labor and delivery units open, period. That everyone, whether you have private insurance or not, is not going to be able to get to possibly the nearest hospital. You might have to go hundreds of miles to deliver your baby. So there's really no way to overstate the impacts that this is going to have on every single American. And this is just one of the many cuts, but it's an important cut. There's no way that you can cut billions of dollars from the Energy and Commerce Committee without cutting Medicaid. Our constituents need us, rely on us, and expect us to stand up for them, and that is what House Democrats are doing. It is time that our Republican colleagues join us in rejecting these devastating cuts, in standing up for their constituents and standing up to President Trump about these terrible policy ideas that are going to continue to make life more expensive and harder for their constituents and for people across the country. So again, I thank you, Assistant Democratic Leader Neguse, for your leadership in bringing us together to talk about these important issues today. And I will now turn the podium over to my colleague on the Energy and Commerce Committee, Representative Kim Schrier.
Thank you, Representative Fletcher, and thank you, Assistant Democratic Leader Neguse, for having this. I think we're all just reeling as we think about the chaos and the destruction to our constituents that is going on in this country right now, and we know that the constituents of our Republican colleagues are hurting just as much as our constituents. I want to echo the sentiments that my colleagues have already expressed about tariffs in particular, along with not just the cost to the people in our communities, but our relationships with our allies around the world. And this is especially true in Washington State, where 2 out of 5 jobs are related to trade overseas, where prices are already rising for consumers, and where this was a double whammy last time, impacting our exports and our imports. In fact, we export nearly $60 billion of goods every single year, from agriculture to airplanes to tech. And so the impacts to manufacturers, to small businesses, to family farms, and to Washington families is really especially profound. Now, this is a replay. We have seen this before. We saw this in the first Trump administration's trade war, and we're already seeing the same impacts again. In fact, following President Trump's tariff announcement, India announced a 20% retaliatory tariff on American apples, causing apple exports from Washington State to India to drop by 99%. This happened last time, and it took me over 2 years to convince India to drop those tariffs. And in the meantime, family farms were decimated. This is reckless. It's reckless to our constituents and to our farmers. The 8th District is actually the apple capital of the world, and our top trading partners are Canada, Mexico, and China. And so these retaliatory tariffs pack a major punch, and they threaten family farms, which is really foundational to, I would say, the culture, the character of the American agricultural economy. And these Trump tariffs also represent a tax on all of our constituents. You know, everything from toothpaste to iPhones is getting much more expensive now. And estimates show that these tariffs are going to cost the average family in our state and around the country nearly $4,000 more per year. So we've seen this play out before. The president's trade war in 2018 was disastrous for Washington state and inflicted serious damage to our family farms and to our constituents. And I just want to be clear, like, there is a time and a place for tariffs, but they need to be strategic. They need to be thoughtful. They need to protect America and not jeopardize our relationships around the world. And so in some cases, I understand the role of tariffs, but this is reckless, it is across the board, and it does not seem at all strategic. We expect a president to be thoughtful and to be considerate. We expect a president to listen to advisors and experts in the field, whether that is in the healthcare field or when it comes to trade. And this is like a bull in a china shop, move fast and break things strategy that is just going to hurt us and our relationships around the world. So I would like to hand this over now to my colleague from Massachusetts, Representative Auchincloss. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks for spending time with us. The president is promising long-term gain for short-term pain with this trade war. He's certainly delivering the short-term pain. We've got job losses and soaring prices and cratered retirement accounts. But this chaotic approach is not going to deliver long-term gain. And here's why. There's 3 conditions for tariffs to be successful. First, the tariffs have to be nested into an industrial policy domestically that has a point of view and a plan about what types of manufacturing and industrial backbone the country wants to domesticate. Trump has none of that. For example, just yesterday, the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology released more than 50 bipartisan recommendations about how we could take the biotech boom that so far has mostly been in places like Boston or California and extend it with manufacturing across the entire country in agriculture and food and materials and industrials and pharmaceuticals. But instead of promoting that domestic manufacturing agenda, he's gutting the Food and Drug Administration and the National Institutes of Health, the very agencies and regulators that we need for this industrial rejuvenation. Number 2, in order for tariffs to be successful, they have to be aligned with diplomacy. Allies and adversaries have to understand what the tariffs mean and what they have to do to adjust to them. Right now, he is picking fights with Canada, our ally, and appeasing Russia, our adversary. So these tariffs are divorced from any coherent diplomacy that either friends or enemies can understand and plan around. And finally, the tariffs have to be codified by Congress with a bipartisan consensus. And the reason why that's so critical is that when there is bipartisan consensus behind a tariff regime, you give long-term certainty for businesses, for consumers, for investors to actually plan their operations and their investments around this tariff regime. But right now, the president is issuing tariffs by tweet, and nobody has any idea how they're supposed to allocate capital for the next day, much less for the next 10 years. So this is a chaotic rollout of tariffs that is going to offer a lot of short-term pain and no long-term gain. But candidly, we're not going to change the president's mind. I think we all kind of know that. What we can do as Congress is to overturn these tariffs. We have that Article 1 power. And yet, Speaker Mike Johnson and congressional Republicans have said flatly they will not even give a hearing to legislation that would take back the power of these emergency tariffs from the president and vest them in Congress. So for Americans who are frustrated by this trade war that is going to hurt American consumers and American businesses, the responsibility, the culpability, the accountability rests with congressional Republicans. And now we'll close out with my friend from Alabama, Representative Figures.
Good morning. At the end of the day, this is about who's going to pay the cost of the president's actions. And this is a president who we know built a career on bankrupting companies. basically getting fat at the dinner table and running out on the bill. We can't afford that. We don't have the luxury as a collective to be able to file bankruptcy and run away from the impacts of these tariffs. These tariffs are going to hit real people in real ways. I represent the state of Alabama, District 2 in Alabama, one of the poorest places in the United States. I have 7 of the 15 poorest counties in the state of Alabama in my district, which means that I have 7 of the poorest counties in the United States of America in my district. Individual median income hovers just north of $30,000 in my district. So when you talk about raising prices on everyday goods that people need, this is going to hit people in real ways in my community that is going to be felt drastically. It's going to be felt drastically. The state of Alabama has worked hard to rise to being a place that is one of the leaders in this nation in automobile manufacturing, and we export over $10 billion a year. Well, the price of that is going to go up, which means that people that work in the state where the automobiles are produced may not be able to afford them. It means that the factories are going to probably have to produce less, which is going to threaten jobs in our communities. You know, this is going to hit people. It's going to hit people in real ways. And we cannot sit silently by. We have to get up. We have to stand up. We have to raise our voices. We need our Republican colleagues to do that with us. We need them not to bow down to President Trump's wishes, but to understand the feelings and the impacts of the people that put them in Congress in the first place. Because at the end of the day, we are here to represent our constituencies. We're here to make sure that America can remain affordable. What we are about to do is to make America more unaffordable for the people who can least afford to do it. This at a time where we're also talking about cutting Medicaid, where we're also talking about $230 billion in cuts to SNAP benefits. I have one of the highest SNAP enrollment rates in the country in my district. We're doing these things to make the rich richer. And that is something that we cannot afford to do, and certainly cannot afford to be silent. We cannot afford to sit here and increase the wealth divide, the divide between rich and poor, the divide between the haves and the have-nots. Because what will happen at the end of the day is the people that are wealthy, they will be stable, but the people that are poor will be unstable. And that is something that we simply cannot tolerate. So I urge my Republican colleagues to stand up with us, to stand up for the people in places like Evergreen, Alabama, and Clayton, Alabama, and Pritchard, Alabama, and Mobile, and Tuskegee. People work hard there, and they don't need government working against them. And that is exactly what is happening with these tariffs, and that is exactly why we're standing here as a collective today, to make sure that the people know that we are with you, we will fight for you, we will stand up against this, and we're urging our Republican colleagues to do the same with us. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Assistant Leader Joe Neguse.
Well, I want to thank my colleagues again for articulating so well the dire consequences of President Trump's reckless actions. Happy to take your questions. Yes.
Thank you. Maeve Sheehy from Bloomberg Government. I was just wondering if you guys have any plan to put a discharge petition out on this tariff issue and potentially force a vote, since GOP leadership does not seem to want to put that on the floor.
I would simply say, I'm not going to opine on the sort of more procedural nature of what you described. I would certainly say that there is legislation pending in the House that's been introduced, just by way of example, by Ranking Member Meeks on the Foreign Affairs Committee, by Chairwoman Del Bene, a senior member of the Ways and Means Committee, that would address this crisis with respect to the president's reckless tariff policies. And I know there's broad support for a number of those different pieces of legislation, and we'll certainly continue to beat the drum with respect to championing those bills. Ultimately, it's up to the Speaker, and as Representative Auchincloss so well described in terms of culpability, the Speaker of the House runs the House floor. House Republicans have a majority. They choose what comes to the floor and what does not. If they decided that these tariffs were unacceptable by virtue of the way in which they're increasing prices for everyday consumers and Americans across the country, they could stop them. We could overturn them by putting any number of these bills, and there's a lot of legislation percolating on the floor. They've chosen not to, and the question really should be when Republicans will stop capitulating and will instead join us in our efforts. Yes.
Thank you for doing this. Michael Jones with Once Up on a Hill. Representative Schrier mentioned that strategic tariffs can be beneficial in protecting vulnerable industries, vulnerable workers. Representative Golden has said the same thing. Some of your city colleagues have said the same thing. How can you thread the needle between making the case for, quote, strategic tariffs while also railing against these Trump tariffs to make sure that Democrats don't, Democratic voters, that grassroots organizers don't conflate your support for strategic tariffs for your support for what you call these terrible Trump tariffs? I just want to know how you all are kind of thinking about messaging to make sure that you're clear about what strategic tariffs you support and these Trump tariffs that you oppose.
I'm happy to give Representative Schrier an opportunity to answer your question. I would just simply say I don't think that it's a tough needle to thread. $6 trillion. $6 trillion in value lost in 1 week. Stock market cratering, bond market floundering, recession on the horizon, all by virtue of this president's reckless tariff policies. The tariffs that he has pursued are clearly a tax increase, the largest peacetime tax increase in the history of the country. Those aren't my words. Those are the words of Mike Pence, his former Republican vice president. So, I recognize your question with respect to sort of more nuanced policy discussions around tariffs, but what this president is pursuing is far afield of that. And I'm happy to. Schrier.
I would agree that this is nuanced, but it feels like this is in a backwards direction. That when you impose these tariffs that drive up prices for things that we still depend on other countries for, you're just hurting American consumers. And you're creating chaos, so manufacturers are actually less likely to put their manufacturing facilities in this country. It seems like you should build up manufacturing here, decide what we need for our national security, and then incentivize the manufacturing all the way through here. Right now, cars would be an example of this, but the car manufacturers depend on products from Canada and Mexico and China to build those cars. And until we're making those components here, this is driving up the cost of American cars. It's probably going to depress sales significantly. And so you have to do this in the right order and be thoughtful about what the goals are and what the outcome is going to be.
I wanted to follow up on Maeve's question. I know you mentioned there is Democratic, legislation on the floor right now to try and restrict the president just slapping these tariffs on without congressional authority. There are reports that Republicans, at least a few, are putting forward legislation that would restrict the president. Would you consider, as Democrats, joining them in a discharge petition to get that to the floor if Republican leadership doesn't support it? And do Democrats feel burned by Republicans, thinking about proxy voting over this last 2-week saga to reach across the aisle and try and work with Republicans in that manner?
Yeah, I would simply say, again, I'm not going to opine about particular procedural vehicles, and I don't want to speak for House leadership more broadly. We're certainly going to work with anyone who's willing to partner with us in good faith to try to repeal and overturn these tariffs and return, as Representative Auchincloss described, the constitutional prerogatives that belong to the Article I branch of government in the United States Congress. Color me skeptical, I will just say. If past is prologue, the last 12 weeks have taught us anything, it's that at every turn, Republicans have capitulated. And we're going to have an opportunity, by the way, to test that premise presumably in a few hours, when Republicans consider their draconian budget proposal on the House floor that would gut Medicaid, cut social safety net programs, all to fund tax cuts for the richest Americans in the country, for billionaires. 4 Republicans choose to oppose that bill, it goes down. I have my, as I said, I'm skeptical. Yes.
A number of Republican senators have started to openly oppose or question the tariffs that Trump's put in place. Do you get the sense that there are Republicans in the House who are willing to also do that? Do you have a sense that there are any who are willing to join Democrats on this issue?
I'm gonna turn it to Representative Peters, who is well known for building relationships with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle.
Well, as you might imagine, a lot of them are really concerned about this and are speaking privately about it. I think Don Bacon has already said he's concerned about it or opposed to it. But again, I think, look, these guys, they fold like origami. I mean, it's embarrassing. I tell them, like, that we all got elected the same day as Donald Trump to do a job here. I took a battle with my party when we were in reconciliation. We made a better bill out of it, and I totally survived. It was part of my, I consider it difficult, but it was part of my job. I just can't believe how craven this group is and how willing to fold they are. So I think that the assistant leader has said it right. We're willing to work with anybody, but these are pretty undependable partners so far.
Yes. Yes.
I wanted to ask about HHS cuts, those grant funding cuts that we've seen for the COVID-19 grants that they put out. I know there's a lawsuit, but have you all heard from your states about what sort of impact that would have for the work that they're doing in the health departments?
Schrier? Oh, and then Jake.
I'll be brief. I've definitely heard from my state, especially as a physician who understands the importance of public health. We allowed the COVID funds that were still out there to be used for very important other public health initiatives, including continuing free testing, free vaccines, those kinds of things. So our public health departments are hurting right now. They're shutting down, and that is leaving communities in need of health care. It's devastating.
I represent Massachusetts. We've got a major healthcare hub. I speak frequently to the universities and the academic medical centers, and whether it's the COVID-19 funds, whether it's the NIH indirect cost rate, whether it's FDA chaos, I think the common theme here is people, even more than programs, and particularly it's young researchers and scientists. What I'm hearing across the board in Massachusetts is that some of the most talented young scientists, born here in the United States, immigrants, are discouraged. They're demoralized. They can't get the funding they need. They're concerned about the integrity of their public sector counterparts. And what it's doing is it is a massive weight around the neck of American innovation. And the Republicans, what they say on our, they feel like they're taking it to the blue states, basically. They love this idea that somehow these attacks on public health and medical research are going to disproportionately impact the blue states. Number one, that's not true, actually. There's universities across the country that are going to bear the brunt of this, red states and blue. But number two, the actual winner here is China. China has been investing massively in the research infrastructure behind its own biotech and biomedical boom, and they're taking the lead. They are going to take the lead from us. They're currently recruiting scientists here in the United States to either return to China or to go to China, and they are going to have the cutting edge on curing disease and on creating good jobs. And it's coming from RFK, from DOGE, and from the White House itself.
And I'll just add to that very briefly. Lizzie Fletcher from Houston, Texas, 7th Congressional District. And I want to pick up where my friend Jake dropped off, which is it is going to hit the red states. It's going to hit the state of Texas. And it's going to hit our community with the COVID grants in particular. We know from our City of Houston Health Department that we're losing about $70 million in grants immediately. The same was true, same announcement, same day in Dallas. They're losing a lot of money. And across the state, there's real money that was budgeted and planned to be spent in short order, and that means immediate closures and immediate shutting down of programs that we are relying on to keep our communities safe. And more broadly, in terms of the NIH cuts, we are so proud to be the home to just incredible, innovative medical research. The Texas Medical Center in Houston is the largest medical complex in the world. There are more than 100,000 people that work there, more than 1 million patient visits, 10 million patient visits every year. It is incredible the amount of devastation that these announcements have caused because of the way that funding is structured. And as a reminder, and I'll wrap up with this, that is a decision that we made as a country to invest in scientific research through universities in partnership with the government. And before I was on the Energy and Commerce Committee, I was on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. And what we heard consistently from every single witness was that industry, academia, and the government worked so well together in our scientific enterprise. It's why we invested in the CHIPS and Science Act and in other things to reinforce scientific research and progress when we were in charge in Congress and when President Biden was in the White House. And those investments are important. They are strategic to Congresswoman Schrier's point earlier, and they're important for our public health and public safety, making sure that we continue to lead the world and that we make our communities safe. And so these devastating cuts are impacting all Americans across the board and will for years to come.
Final two questions, ma'am.
Just a quick follow-up to the question that had to do with sort of threading that needle when it comes to strategic tariffs and that sort of nuanced issue there. Your party is really trying to find that blue-collar worker to come back to you and your base. Yet since the 90s, you've gone through NAFTA and seen those jobs go overseas. And the Republicans are really clubbing you guys a whole lot with showing those old clips of Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, as well as Bernie Sanders, like talking about those trade imbalances, and they're saying, look, it's a job loser, and they're saying, like these tariffs are truly unfair, et cetera, and they're saying the only reason why that Democrats today are simply opposing Trump's policies because it's coming from Trump. Now, is this because simply that you guys are only like those particular lawmakers were simply opposing it because it was because of China, or is it because it's like, oh, it's now all these countries right now? Can we kind of start specifying exactly where you guys stand today and where it was back then with those particular lawmakers?
Yeah, look, I mean, I am less interested in C-SPAN videos from the early 90s when I was 7 years old, and I think from my perspective,
But it's representing your party.
I hear you, but I will just tell you, my constituents aren't particularly focused on what you mentioned, Chuck Schumer was saying in 1991. They're focused right now, the farmers in my district, on the devastation that is coming their way and the reality that family farms in northwestern Colorado are going to bear the brunt of these tariffs and the price increases that will follow. My constituents, consumers in my district, are very worried about the fact that there's a 60% chance, according to most economists, of a recession if we're not experiencing one already by virtue of the president's reckless tariff policy. So that's why, for me, I just, I, with respect, disagree with the premise, I suppose, of your question, because I don't think that it is a particularly difficult needle to thread. The president's policies are erratic and nonsensical. Every economist across the ideological spectrum, whether it's an economist who believes that tariffs can be strategically an important tool, or an economist who disagrees with tariffs across the board, every economist concurs that this policy is insane. No one is promoting this, and so I just think that we ought to level with the American people. If we want to have a debate about, again, strategic deployment of tariffs, we can have that debate. That's not what this debate is. This debate is whether or not the President of the United States is going to pull back from taking actions that are going to drive the globe into a recession and that are going to create a lot of harm for families across our country. So,
done a complete 180 since the 90s then?
again, I think I've answered your question, but I don't, if Mr. Auchincloss, I think, wanted to jump in. But, oh, okay, all right.
Yeah,
Yes.
just say,
I'll have you jump in on the next one. Yep. Yes, ma'am.
So earlier on, you mentioned that the stance for Democrats is that you're willing to work with Republicans in good faith, if they're working with you guys in good faith, to implement bills, well, to put forward legislation that would restore the ability to implement tariffs to Congress. And I wanted to know, how concerned are you that if this happens, Democrats would essentially be bailing Republicans out, when Republicans would almost certainly never do the same for Democrats if you guys were in a similar situation?
Yeah, look, I'm not concerned about the political or electoral consequences. What I'm concerned about, and this is genuine, I mean, I think you heard this from my colleagues, the real harm that is going to come to families that we represent, the job losses, the ability for folks to be able to continue to afford their mortgages, the likelihood for mass foreclosures here in the coming months, there's going to be real harm, dire consequences for our constituents. And so I think you've heard us make the case that we will do everything we can to prevent President Trump's policies from coming to fruition insofar as they harm American taxpayers. But again, we've seen no signal from our colleagues that they have any interest in actually working to prevent that harm from materializing. They could do that on their own volition today. And instead, they are barreling their way through with a bill today, $5 trillion debt ceiling increase to pay for trillions of dollars of tax increases for billionaires, and paying for it by gutting Medicaid. I don't have, as I said, much optimism that they're ultimately going to come to the table in any meaningful way.
I just want to just address the 180 comment. In 2015, President Obama proposed a free trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, with Asia, and it did pass the House. I was one of the Democrats who supported it. There was a dispute then about whether the benefits of trade, which were kind of acknowledged, were distributed appropriately. That was dealt with in the USMCA. President Trump's agreement, which was supported by Democrats and Republicans alike. You want to ask who's done a 180, it's President Trump. And I represent border city, San Diego. We're getting killed by his turning his back on his own deal that we all supported, because we figured out a way, we thought, to do free trade with a fair distribution of benefits on this side of the border. We should be following that model. And if you ask who's doing a 180, again, it's Donald John Trump.
On that note, thank you all so much for coming. We appreciate it.